MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, breaking down USC football as the Trojans prepare for a trip to Stanford and a bad blood rivalry with the Cardinal. North taking on South there in California. We got Scott Wolf on the line. You can join him at Inside USC. Joining us for the first time here at MarkRogersTV, we invite you to like, comment, and subscribe as we bring the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry on each and every night. Scott, how you doing tonight?
Doing good, Mark. I'm looking for a USC helmet on your shelf there. I don't see one yet.
Okay, well, I'll make an explanation of that. Although Washington made the college football playoff 2 years ago, we all know that USC had the best team. They won the game in Seattle by 2 scores and then won the Rose Bowl. But I initially made my purchase with the 4 playoff teams from last year, and then picked up 2 at work just a few weeks ago that were just kind of stragglers out there, Tennessee and Ole Miss. So, yeah, I do need to factor in USC.
I like the ones you have up there.
They certainly factor in prominently. So
maybe
we have to go that route. Well, they're one of those programs, obviously, that's relevant, even if they aren't relevant on the field. But this year remains to be seen. And much of that obviously rides on JT Daniels. And in regards to all off season, all the conversation I had concerning USC football surrounded around this 18-year-old kid and everyone's desire to see him win the job, which he certainly did. And your thoughts on his first game performance?
I thought he was fine. He made a couple mistakes, but for a true freshman, I thought he did a really good job. I don't think you could expect more than what he did. The problem is he's the most hyped quarterback to ever come into USC. And maybe, I don't know where else, maybe he's the most hyped in the country. But he's never going to live up to the expectations that people put on him. So he did fine. He did better than Matt Barkley, I think, in his first start, which was a similar situation. But, I think people who think he's going to come in and be better than Sam Darnold or something crazy like that, that's not going to happen. So he's still got a ways to go. And, I don't think he's ever going to be Sam Darnold, but some people probably would disagree with that.
Of course, Barkley was the only other true freshman quarterback that started a season opener at USC going back to 2009. And then, if I remember correctly, with only 1 game under his belt, went to Columbus the next week and pulled off a last-minute drive against Ohio State to engineer a victory against the Buckeyes in an exciting game in Columbus. We got Scott Wolf on the line from Inside USC to talk up the Trojans. So, Ross St. Brown, obviously a running mate of JT Daniels at Mater Dei, and they hooked up for a touchdown. And another reason to be excited, regardless of the bumps in the road against a UNLV team that was clearly outclassed in the long run, that these two connected, and that might be the future of USC highlights in the passing game.
Yeah, you could make the case, the 2 best players on the team Saturday were both true freshmen from Mater Dei. And then you could also make the case, maybe the 3rd best was the kicker, who was 5 for 5, and he went to Mater Dei. So if they didn't have Mater Dei players, I don't know where they'd be at the moment. But definitely, the true freshmen, I think, they came through as expected. But football's a game with a lot of guys on the field. And frankly, I saw a team, it looked just like a continuation of last year to me. A lot of sloppy play, inconsistent, maybe a little lack of focus, which was a problem last season. So I still see the things they needed to fix last year showing in the first game. And that's why I think it's so important what happens at Stanford, because if they play like that against Stanford, I think they're going to be in trouble.
So the one thing you bring up right there, despite Darnold in play and Ronald Jones and obviously Deontay Burnett, one of the prolific receivers in the country last year, they bogged down in the red zone more than you would think and didn't cash in as much as you thought you would think with that much talent on the field. The offensive line didn't play well against the better teams, most notably the Notre Dame game on the road, Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl, giving up all those sacks. So the offensive line, they got to make it all happen. Do you have hopes of this unit being better than what we saw last year?
I'm hesitant to say that simply because they've got a couple of guys that are seniors that played last week when they struggled. They have another senior, Toa Lobendon, who's coming back and playing center for the first time in a couple of years on Saturday. So we'll see what he's at. But, they do have quite a few veterans on this offensive line. So I'm not sure at this point how these guys are going to get much better. And then the flip side of that is the defensive line, a lot of people told me was going to be the strength. They gave up 308 yards rushing against UNLV. And some of those were big plays, and they stopped UNLV on a lot of other plays. But 300 yards is still 300 yards in a game rushing. And that's against UNLV. So Stanford is obviously going to try to run the ball too.
So for a program that Scott always has the expectations through the roof, and certainly the fan base does, considering, I guess on the plus side is that it's still the most talented roster in the division. No question. Yeah. But it's a weak division. So you might not necessarily have a sterling record, but can still get to a Pac-12 championship game. So what do you think is the prevailing mindset of the fan base, the reasonable fan base for USC football this year?
Well, I think, when they look at the schedule, they probably think they might lose a few games this season. It would be a natural assumption. I mean, at Stanford and at Texas in back-to-back weeks, that's pretty tough. But I think the mindset is kind of like last year. It's USC. They do have the most talent in the Pac-12. I mean, every recruiting class is always the highest ranked in the conference every year. And yet, I don't see anyone, the fans don't feel a lot of confidence because I don't think they bought into Clay Helton. And they still feel like he hasn't proven himself as a coach. And, I've talked about this a lot. Did he live off of Sam Darnold a lot the last 2 years with all the victories, at the last second or fourth quarter where it looked like Darnold was just a magician out there? And, what is Helton going to do now? He's still got a highly touted quarterback, but, is it just going to be USC relies on superior talent all the time and, they get out coached? So, this is an ongoing problem with USC football.
All right, Scott, we'll settle right there because you hit on the question that I wanted to ask, and you started to make your thoughts and feelings known, and from some of those from the fan base as well. It was just a turnstile at the head coaching spot for a year and a half to 2 years there, with the issues with Sarkisian and Lane Kiffin obviously not working out for different reasons. And then Clay Helton stabilizes things to a certain extent at the end of that 2015 season. And then, the positives are that the record looks good overall. Can't remember it off the top of my head, but it's like 21-3 over his last 24 games, something in that range, obviously with a big, long winning streak to conclude 2016. But when they've matched up again, to bring up the Ohio State and Notre Dame games in particular, those were not pretty affairs. I don't know that people would be as critical had they lost 24-21 games, but they just didn't look the part in those games, what they're supposed to be. So are you looking at the Rose Bowl win and Pac-12 championship for the first time in 9 years, or looking at some of the weaker efforts against better competition as being Clay Helton's signature right now?
Well, I think there's a great stat. I think he's 17-0 at the Coliseum, which is to me, it's an amazing stat, no matter who they're playing. But, they beat UCLA, their crosstown rival, at the Coliseum last year, and the gun goes off to end the game, and the fans aren't even cheering or clapping against the most hated team on the schedule. And it was because they were so frustrated that they almost lost the game, and they didn't play clean, and still have, special teams errors and things like that. So, they've probably had 40 to 45,000 people at the game last week. So you don't see that energy like when Pete Carroll was coaching, where he energized the fans and people were excited about the team and everything. And, maybe it's hard to compare Helton to Pete Carroll, but USC, this is the bar they've set as a program. They want to be Alabama. They want to be what they were 10 years ago. And right now, it just feels like, there's a little bit of I described it today as a malaise on the team. Like they don't come out and just dominate UNLV, which they should do if they're a good team. So I just think a lot of people are skeptical right now about where they're going. And there's no doubt, you look at that roster, it's got a lot of talented players and stuff, but everyone wants to know, is Clay Helton and the coaching staff going to harness it and actually do something with it? Because let's be honest, the Pac-12 is a traditionally weak conference lately. And if you win it, it's great, but you're still not a national player. If you win it, you got to go to the college football playoff and do something if you want to be important.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing that USC wins the Pac-12 last year, and it's the USC brand. It's not that Utah jumped up or Colorado and won the Pac-12 and were taken lightly, but USC, it was Alabama versus Ohio State talk for that fourth spot at the college football playoff, and USC given very little consideration because of the relative perspective on the Pac-12 being weak, and then the conference backed it up in postseason play with only one win in 8 outings. So the Pac-12 needing desperately some marquee wins against the nation. They had a chance at that with Washington, Auburn, and weren't quite able to pull that one off. And obviously will have their dates against Notre Dame and USC and Stanford in particular. We got Scott Wolf on the line from Inside USC. And before we continue, Scott, where can people find you just to find all your information and insight into the Trojans?
Well, on Twitter, it's Inside USC. And then I have a USC blog, which is insideusc.blog, which should be pretty easy to remember, I would think.
But
just type Inside USC into Google, and usually something will come up.
Very nice. So this Stanford rivalry wasn't necessarily something that I was tuned into. Being a huge college football fan, it didn't come to mind as this huge rivalry. Now, obviously, Stanford's emerged in the last 10 years, first under Jim Harbaugh, as a major player on the national scene. And it's been competitive in the last 10 years. But for me, that was the end of it. It was just simply, well, this became a rivalry because both teams are good and vying for the Pac-12 championship. But as I've learned from some Stanford people that I'm in contact with, there's a little bit more to this series than just both teams are good, therefore it's a rivalry.
Yeah, I mean, it's really gone back, over 100 years, the rivalry, so it's been a long-standing thing. Now, John McKay hated Stanford in the 60s and 70s, and he hated their fans, and he complained. But more in the modern era, I think it's the whole, Jim Harbaugh, Pete Carroll got the rivalry going again, and there was that huge upset, when they were underdogs by about 42 points, and they beat USC at the Coliseum. And you've had some really good games too. When Andrew Luck was there, they went to overtime at the Coliseum and beat USC. And even last year, the Pac-12 title game, USC was the clear favorite, and Sam Darnold made this miraculous throw from his own end zone on a long pass, and that kind of kept USC from blowing the game. And they had a goal line stand also against Bryce Love and Stanford on that game. So I think there's it used to be kind of a genteel rivalry, I would say, in the 80s and 90s, but I think it's gotten a little more heated. And I think it's for both teams, it's a big deal because they always they end up playing each other the second game of the season because they both play Notre Dame. So the Pac-12 has to make that an early game because of their schedules when they play Notre Dame either at mid-season or at the end of the season. So every year now, I think the fans know they're going to play Stanford the second game of the year, and it might have implications on winning the conference one way or another.
So I watched Stanford knock off San Diego State 31-10. It was a close game for 2.5 to 3 quarters going into the fourth quarter. And Stanford actually used a formula that you wouldn't expect. They had to go to the passing game to win that game as Bryce Love was ganged up on, and San Diego State clearly sold out on him to try to stop him. And they were effective, but lost the war 31-10. Your thoughts about Stanford? Don't know if you had much time to prep the Cardinal, but based on previous seasons, and if you did see San Diego State, and just your feeling about the odds of USC going up there and pulling off, I won't even call it an upset, but most people would consider Stanford to be, because of home field advantage, maybe that much better.
Well, I saw at halftime of that San Diego State Stanford game, I told someone USC's in a really good position to win that game next week. And then the next day I watched USC play and I told that same person, well, on second thought, Stanford's looks like they have a pretty good shot to win that game too. I'm sure USC saw, though, the way, like you said, they loaded up the box and stopped Bryce Love. But the interesting part to me was Stanford showed that they're a two-dimensional team. And they weren't two-dimensional when they played the first time last year at the Coliseum. And even in the game up at the Bay Area for the Pac-12 title, AJ Costello, he was still kind of a new guy. I mean, he had taken over, but there were questions about what he could do. And he ended up, I thought, played pretty good. But, I think now he's a better quarterback, more experienced. And the thing about USC, last week they faced a one-dimensional offense, a team that could run the ball and could not pass. And now they're going to be in a dilemma because they can load up on Love, but you've got those receivers, the tall tight ends that he can throw to. And then if they start getting burned by the pass, that's when Bryce Love's going to get going. So they pose some problems to USC's defense right now.
This is Mark Rogers, Mark Rogers TV, voice of college football. We bring on the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the nation, including some analysis from myself, of course. And we talk USC-Stanford, maybe the marquee game of the week nationally. Scott, we both mentioned the Pac-12 and the rough going last year, and it kind of extended a little bit further back. It hasn't been that long since it was considered arguably the second best conference in the nation. Do you think this is something that's cyclical, or are there real issues with the Pac-12 in regards to recruiting, brand, and so forth?
Well, I think it is in some ways cyclical because you had Oregon and USC who were nationally, two of the best programs in the country. And now you've got Washington is resurgent again. But I think if you look at it from the conference's perspective, they're a little more worried about falling behind financially because their TV deals are not going to bring in the revenue like the SEC, the Big 10, the Big 12. They're falling behind in those figures. So I think their concern is that going to affect us with the product that we're putting on the field, because they're always trying to upgrade facilities because a lot of the schools don't have facilities close to what the SEC or Big 10 schools do. So I think, and then you have the dilemma, which is, I know you know all about this, but the Pac-12 network and who gets to see games on that, who gets to watch the night games at 7:30. I mean, Stanford's had four runner-ups in the Heisman Trophy. And is that because they're playing at night? And a lot of these Heisman voters are not even watching the game or can't get the game. So those are things that can't be overcome unless you have the best coaches in the country. And right now, they've had a lot of turnover coaching wise, both Arizona schools, Oregon State. Cal has a second-year coach. So UCLA has a new coach, obviously, which didn't look so hot last weekend, but obviously it's his first game. But so I think they have concerns that maybe we're falling behind here a little bit. And then when you have that 1-8 bowl performance, that makes it worse. And then you see Arizona lose to BYU and UCLA lays an egg against Cincinnati. And all of a sudden you're like, wow, is this going to be another bad season for the conference? I mean, it's bad when the best win of the opening weekend was a loss to Auburn, a narrow loss. So, they got to silence the critics. And right now they're not doing anything to silence anybody.
Yeah, and it's a great point because Washington did have to travel cross country, played a quasi road game, and it was a slugfest. I thought it was the best game of the weekend in regards to two really good teams going toe to toe. It wasn't always pretty, but man, it was a hard hitting physical game, and it could have gone either way. It just so happened Washington lost. They could have won if they played the next week. Who knows? They were that close. But unfortunately for the Pac-12, their supposed best team, most likely best team, but we shall see, gets tagged with a loss out of conference. Now it appears as though Washington's going to have to run the table and be based on your outlook of USC and mine and most people as well, they could win the South, but to come through the conference and the out of conference unscathed is unlikely. So looks like all hope's on Washington, and they've already lost a game. So they may need to run the table in the Pac-12 for the Pac-12 not to get left out again.
Yeah, and now they're in a weird position where conference has to root for Auburn to win their games because they don't want Auburn to slip down in the SEC, because then all of a sudden that loss doesn't look so hot when we're in December and they're trying to pick 4 teams. So, I mean, I don't think it was a death knell or anything that lost to Auburn, but they definitely now need some things. They need a little help, and they might get it. But what are we going to do at the end of the year if there's 2 SEC teams again that are dominant? And are they going to leapfrog the Pac-12? I don't think anyone will be surprised if it happens again. So that's kind of where the problem is. You get into this situation where there's not that expectation, like, oh yeah, we're automatically in the playoff because we won our conference. So you got to earn it, though. I mean, I didn't have a problem with Georgia and Alabama going together the Final Four last year, but the Pac-12 has to do something to change its perception.
As mentioned on the live chat here by our guy, Buckeye State Sports, I was certainly in the camp of Christian McCaffrey winning the Heisman for Stanford in 2015. I thought he was robbed of that trophy to Derrick Henry, who had a great season, but McCaffrey was the best player in the country. McCaffrey. What's that?
So I agree with you. I have a Heisman vote, so I did vote for him. But I do think it hurt him being on the West Coast and being at Stanford.
Absolutely. At least you're voting for the right guys there. That's good to know. We got Scott Wolf on the line. You can join him at Inside USC. One other thing for you. You brought up the coaching changes across the Pac-12, and obviously UCLA is right across town, and Chip Kelly is a name. So did that shake up anyone in Trojan land in regards to that hire, that could be a threat?
Oh, definitely. Here's the ironic thing. 2 years ago, people were telling me at SC that Lynn Swann wanted to hire Chip Kelly as the head coach. And that was the guy he was zeroing in on if they were going to replace Clay Helton. So I think when they hired Chip Kelly, a lot of people at SC felt like, they kind of pulled one over on SC because now they have the marquee coach and they have the guy that probably excites people and the guy that's going to be popular with the fans and run a high-powered offense and all that stuff that's associated with him. So I think a lot of people were nervous. Now, I know a lot of USC fans on social media were gloating last weekend because he lost his first game. But, I mean, you can't judge, probably this whole year, you can't judge him by because he's inherited, a program that's kind of struggling and it's going to need some time. And, the great stat I saw is he's never lost back-to-back games in college as a head coach. And now he goes to Oklahoma. So I think that stat's going to fall for the first time in his career.
Yeah, most of those fall at some point during, if you coach long enough. The stat that I found interesting, as I did a little bit of research during the off season, was that, and we know that the recruiting rankings mean a whole lot in volume, but they can belie what's on the field, the product on the field. But that Chip Kelly, in going 33 in the Pac-12, 33-3 in the Pac-12, and 46-7 overall at Oregon, basically almost ranking by ranking, his final roster at Oregon, those 4 years, had the same recruiting rankings as UCLA has over the last 4 years. So theoretically, he's working with the same level of talent at UCLA as he did at Oregon.
Well, yeah, that was the thing I talked to SC fans about when he got the job. I said, look, he's gotten more from less. He's used to doing that, whereas USC has all these highly touted guys and they kind of underachieve. So he doesn't need to have a recruiting class that's the same as USC's to be successful. And he knows, how to go find those 3-star guys and get them to overachieve and stuff like that. So, My question is, he's been gone from the college game for a few years, so does he still have it? We'll see. And there's a lot more high tempo teams now. He was kind of the only guy, it seemed like, when he first came in at Oregon, and now everybody's doing it more or less. So I don't know if he can still, pull things on opponents like he used to. But he definitely is a good coach. I mean, I think it was a good hire, but you got to be patient as he's got to rebuild that program. The morale hasn't been great over there for the last couple of years. So, I think back at John Robinson at SC. He got blown out his first game, and everyone wanted him fired in 1976. And then they ended up winning, I think, every game the rest of that season and went to the Rose Bowl. Now, I'm not predicting that, obviously, when Kelly's going to go play Oklahoma, but you can't judge anybody by the first weekend of the season, obviously.
So we got Scott Wolf on the line from Inside USC, and before we let you go, it did make me think of one other question concerning all this coaching situation potentially at USC. Clay Helton wins, he'll keep his job, but to what level does he need to win? Well, you have a little bit of a little indication based on what Lynn Swann has had to hire and fire, because there's not anything there. But your thoughts about what would Clay Helton need to do this particular year and going forward to keep his job at SC?
Well, a part of it to me is I don't think it's his record necessarily as much as what you're seeing on the field, because last year they went to the Cotton Bowl, and Lynn Swann was at the game, and he talked to a bunch of former players, famous guys like Anthony Munoz, Ronnie Lott was there, a bunch of these guys, and he told them, look, it's how you play in the big games that matters. How are you going to do against Ohio State? How are you going to do against Notre Dame? That's the important thing. This is USC. We got to win those games. So I don't care if we're beating Arizona or Arizona State or Oregon State or whatever. So if they win 8 or 9 games, but everybody's complaining that they're sloppy, underachieving, and they get blown out by, say, Notre Dame or somebody else, Washington, in a Pac-12 title game, people are going to be upset again. So it'll depend on how much Lynn Swann wants to deal with all that.
Hey, Scott, first time on Mark Rogers TV. We appreciate your information, the insight. You've got a great site there at Inside USC, so everybody check it out. You're welcome back anytime.
Hey, I had a blast. I've never done this before. It was fun.
Definitely. Stanford USC should be a good one. Thanks a lot, Scott.
Thanks, Mark.